having a public hearing despite what it says on
Oh,
your
I'm
screen.
sorry, yeah.
So
You
I'd
did
like
that.
a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
I make a motion to amend the meeting under emergency circumstances.
Say that again?
Want to amend the meeting under emergency circumstances. From what I understand, I just got told with Mr. Brandon just a few minutes ago,
Mr. Who?
Brandon from the district courts, he said he sent a letter to you on August 1st stating that you guys had replied within so many days. You have not, so you're violating that to set a special election date. So we're kind of under the gun here. If we don't set a special election date, again, we're just opening ourselves up for liability with, as the thing. From what I understand, I'm going to go back a little bit more. I've been in contact with the Attorney
I
General of
don't,
the
wait,
state
I
of
don't know
Idaho.
that there's the amended,
Yes.
meeting amendment
We're-
has not happened.
Right, we want to amend that, but I'm just explaining why. We should have never had that meeting the other day, but we need to go into a special meeting for the emergency circumstances.
What's the emergency?
That by 5 o'clock today, if we don't file some of the courts, we're in violation, not saying it's a special election date.
I don't think we can go to a special meeting for that.
Well,
Well, I was told I could.
Well, you were told wrong.
there's a
Told I
motion
can call for it.
There's a motion right now on the floor to
to
amend
amend the agenda.
to amend the agenda.
Is there a second?
So,
To amend the agenda?
Yes.
For what?
No second to the agenda meeting amendment? Then it fails.
okay, well, I'm just saying it's in violation of stuff.
Is it 5 o'clock yet?
No, but
Okay,
I
thank
do
you.
know the Attorney General's involved in that too.
Thank you. Now, we have on our agenda today, to meet with JUB engineers to discuss the water facility plan.
How are you?
I'm good.
Sorry, I just shut my computer off accidentally.
Uh-oh. Some brains do that, actually.
They don't even have.
Yes.
So we're gonna give the floor to Mr. Jones from JUB to discuss the
Yes, that's the agenda
facility
item.
plan.
Good, well, again, last time we met, we talked about what the next steps were on this facility plan. And at that point, we had a lot of different things that we were talking about. We've been through a couple bond elections, there's been lots of input about what is important and what makes sense here. I wanted to just take a little bit of time to recap where we are with the project and then figure out if there is any path forward, right? Or what our path forward might be. So a couple things. Right now, what we've done is submit a draft facility plan, and that's gone to DEQ. They have given us technical review comments. In that facility plan, there was a recommended project, and once we get that final recommended, once we get the technical review comments addressed, then the board needs to decide what their preferred project is. And at that point, the facility planning process is over, and the board can move forward however you want. So we have technical review comments on the table, and I wanted to take a little bit of time to review how we got here and what our next steps are. And we talked about this at the last meeting.
Yeah.
So give me just a minute, I'll get back up to speed here. First thing, as Sharon mentioned, this is not a public hearing. I'm going to modify my slide here. This is just an update. All right. So I've got a couple things. Hopefully that pops up. A couple things on my agenda. One is to review how we got to where we are, at least some of the initial criteria, and the board members should all have a packet like this. What we're going to talk about is all on the slide, so I just want to make sure board members had a walk away. So we've got a couple things. The system has a number of deficiencies that need to be addressed, and then also some other challenges and goals that have come up in the last, what's been been almost 10 months, some additional items. So we'll talk about those, talk a little bit about potential options or steps forward, and then how we wrap this thing up at the end. So I'm going to start out by doing a quick overview of essentially what the deficiencies were, and then we'll go through the remainder of that agenda. The goal is to select a recommended or preferred alternative today, is what we need. So we'll work through that process. So I'm going to start by just talking about the existing system deficiencies. This slide you may all remember from 18 months ago or so when we started this. I imagine some of you could give this presentation as well as I can, but we'll walk through them. There were three major items: non-revenue water, and that's basically leaks in your system, low water pressure and inadequate fire flow, so the areas of the system that have low pressure, and areas where you just can't get as much water out as you might want to fight fires, and then long-term maintenance and reliability issues. So the non-revenue water, I'll skip over this quickly, but there are a bunch of issues here. One of them is you've got some old pipelines that are leaking. The Navy base is unmetered, and so use is unknown. There are older meters in town that may be inaccurate, we just don't know. And then we discovered, we didn't, but Cooch discovered that the well pump had a preloop problem. So about 35 gallons a minute was flowing down just down into the well all day long. So that was a big part, maybe a third of the overall loss that we have. So that's good to know.
Is it good to know?
It was great, yeah. And if we look at, these are just your tank levels. If you look at that performance over time, what we did was we shut the wells off and we let the water flow out of the tanks. And during the middle of the night when you shouldn't have very much usage, you were losing about 50 gallons a minute. So quite a bit of water was flowing out of the tank. Steve?
So do you think that thing that Cooch found was
It's about half.
showing up right here?
Yep,
Okay.
I think so.
I do water my garden at night, so
And some of that,
I know a lot of.
yeah, so there's some of that still too. So there's
This was
people,
in the winter, however.
yeah,
March.
probably before irrigation started. And the trend you see, because it's so linear, looks like normal leakage. If we were seeing some curves in that line, then that would be more usage. So I said 50 gallons a minute, but that's about 100 gallons a minute that we're losing, and 35 gallons a minute was the pre-loop, so about a third. So that's about 50 million gallons a year that disappears through leaks. Second group of issues were low water pressure and fire flow. Now, the district has not had very much in the way of low pressure complaints, right? I'm not aware of much of that. The main problem is that you're not meeting DEQ's requirements for minimum pressure of 40 psi in some areas. And those are primarily the top and lower pressure zone on the kind of north side of Bayview and the Drumore area, because the existing tank is small and the top of that tank isn't high enough to keep adequate pressure in the Drumore area. In addition, because it's only 11,000 gallons, there's not much fire flow in the Drumore area. So that's the Drumore tank. It was built in the 70s. There are lots of issues with this tank, as we're all familiar here, but it contributes to both low fire flow and low pressure. So we looked a little bit at the overall system. What are your pressures in the system? And if you look at this map, the things you want to pay attention to are purples and reds. The reds are low pressure, pressures under 40 psi, and the purples are high pressures over 110 psi. Typically that's a normal range. Under 40 psi you run the risk that contamination come in the system, and over 110 psi you start to have damage to plumbing. Now most of that the purples on the lower, the high pressure, they don't actually have service, and that's along the bottom of the lake, but served by the Cape Horn pump station. So very little of that's really a problem here. It was designed to have that higher pressure so we can get up the hill. The reds, though, are where you can see some pressure problems. So up here in the northwest corner, and then Dromore are the primary issues of red. And then also out here in the Cape Horn area, you've got a couple low pressure areas that happen to be right below where there's a valve that controls pressure and creates that low pressure. So the biggest pressure issues really are right here in the north and northwest corner of the system. So that's not too bad. You've got some decent stuff, areas we knew were problems. And then fire flow, you've got a couple issues here. The fire marshal wants to make sure that there's at least 500 gallons a minute of fire flow. So if we look at anything that's red, that's less than 500 gallons a minute of fire flow. Anything yellow is between 500 and 1,000, and anything that's orange is between 1,000 and 1,500, and then finally the purples are over 1,500. The 1,500 is important because the fire marshal wants you to have that in the main downtown Bayview area. That's the target for especially around the commercial areas, 1,500 gallons a minute. So on the current system, you've got decent fire flow downtown. As you go out, you're between 500 and 1,000, which means a residential requirement. As you go out into Cape Horn, there's some low pressure areas, and Dromore, there's some low flow areas, less than 500 gallons a minute. So they don't meet the criteria that was established. So that establishes more or less where we are with pressures and fire flows in the system. The third part is long-term maintenance and reliability. These are older parts of the system. So major components, especially related to Farragut, were installed in the 40s and some in the mid-70s. So the system's getting older. It doesn't mean that it's not a great system, but it means that there's some things that are going to need to be upgraded. Well number 7, for example, needs an automatic backup power. So you've got a generator on well 7, but if the power knocks out, the operators have to manually start that. So there's a way to get that automatically started. And then the Navy was really innovative when they did projects. One of the things they did was use torpedo tubes to manage surges. So when you kick a pump on, it will put a big pressure surge in the system. What they used a torpedo tube to absorb that pressure. But because of how they were manufactured, we can't use them any longer. So DEQ's identified that as something that needs to be replaced. The SCADA, which is your control system's outdated, does need to be updated. And there's no backup power at Farragut Reservoir. So if you lose power, you don't have any controls for the pump, even though well 7 has
Excuse me,
a
Steve, that's
generator.
changed, we did update that, that was done recently.
Okay.
We had backup power at the tower.
At the tower,